Hello folks. So now I've gotten to the point where the player can actually be controlled and I can move him left and right across the screen. And what's more, I've added in limits so that he can't go beyond the screen. What I want to work on now is adding in up and down movement. And before I get into that, I will just bring up this quick image to explain what's going to happen. So the left and right is already done, that's the green arrows here, and I've got my delta x variable that controls that. The up and down movement will be done in more or less the same way. I will have a delta y variable which is added on to the rectangle's y position, so that's going to move it up and down accordingly. However, one thing that I need to consider here is gravity. So the player is pretty much always going to be pulled down the way. So this gravity force is constantly going to be decreasing, or rather increasing, the pull that is on this player in the vertical direction. So the way I'm going to code this is, first of all, I will add this gravity, and that's what's going to pull the player down, and I'll add in the functionality for jumping, which is what's going to push him back up again against gravity. So with that explained, I'll just jump into the code. The first thing I need to do is actually add this gravity into it as a variable. I haven't defined a section in my code yet for my game variables, so I will add this in between where I've got my frame rate and where I've got my colors. I will add another little section here. So I will say game variables, and this one is going to be called gravity. So it's a constant variable, and therefore I'm going to use capitals for this one. And I'm just going to set gravity to 1. In this context, it just means 1 pixel. So by playing around with this variable, you can increase how fast the player falls down. Now that I've defined the gravity, I can go into my player class here and actually add that gravity into it. So remember, I have dx and dy variables right at the beginning of the move method, and then those variables are used to control the position of the rectangle. So at the moment, the dy variable doesn't actually change at any point. It's always 0, and that's why the player doesn't move up and down. But before I add this in, there is one more variable that I want to add. So I will come back up to my constructor, which is my init method. And just above this flip, I will add in another self variable. I will say self.vel_y. So this stands for velocity in the y direction, so my vertical velocity. And this is going to start off at 0. Then I'll go back into my move method, and underneath where I'm processing the key presses and defining my dx and dy, I'll add another little section here. I will comment it to say gravity. And now I can change that variable. So that self.vel_y is going to be increased by the gravity variable. That means that every iteration of this game loop, this y velocity is going to be increasing by 1, because that's what I've set the gravity to. So rather than a constant speed, it's actually going to be speeding up. So it will accelerate at every iteration as this variable goes higher and higher. Then once I've got this variable, I can add it to my dy. So I can say the dy is increased by self.vel_y. Now at this point you could say, why am I adding this variable? I could just say dy is increased by gravity. And in what I've coded so far, that would make sense, and that would work exactly in the same way. However, when it comes to the jumping section a little bit later on, it does make sense to split them out like this. So I'm just doing it from the beginning. Now that should be everything that I need to actually have this working, because if I go back down here, I already have this section that increases the rectangle's y coordinate by this dy variable. So if I run this again, what should happen is the dy is going to increase, or sorry, self.vel_y is going to increase by 1 each iteration, and that's going to in turn move my dy up. And of course, an increasing y coordinate is meaning that you're moving down the screen. So very, very quickly, the player is going to fall off, and you're not really going to see him for very long. So I can see that the gravity is working. You can see him just dropping off very quickly there. So what I need now is a way of stopping the player from falling all the way off. Basically, I need to define this as my floor. So the bottom of my game window is going to be the point at which this player can bounce and jump back up. Now I can add that in just underneath where I've got my collision at the moment. So here I'm checking whether the player is going off the left and right hand side of the screen. And just below that, I can make sure that it doesn't go off the bottom of the screen. Now this is only temporary, because in the actual game the player is going to be jumping on platforms, and falling off the bottom of the screen is actually going to be a game over condition. But for now I'm just going to add this in because I don't have the platforms coded in. So let's say check collision with ground. Now remember, I haven't actually moved the rectangle yet. So far the rectangle is exactly where it was in the previous iteration, but I have calculated what the dy is going to be. So I know where I'm going to be after this movement. So what I want to do is check whether moving by this variable of dy is going to put me off the screen. So I can say if self.rect.bottom plus dy. So pretty much what I've done previously. I did my x direction check in the same way. So now I'm just saying that I'm looking for the underside of the rectangle plus this increased variable. If that is going to be greater than the screen height, so basically if that's going off the bottom of the screen, well, that means that I don't really want them to be able to continue, and instead I want them to bounce back up here. And this is where the difference between dy and self.val_y comes in. So I want the player to essentially freeze, because at this point they've hit the ground. I don't want them to go back up yet, but I just want them to stop where they are. So the dy variable becomes 0. At this point, I'm not changing the y coordinate. I'm keeping the player exactly where he is, but I want him to bounce back up. So remember, this self.val_y variable is constantly increasing by gravity. So this is a positive variable when the player is moving down the way. As soon as I've hit the ground, he's going to be jumping back up. And by jumping, he's giving himself a velocity in the opposite direction. So he's giving him a large negative velocity. I can then say self.val_y is something negative. So I can say -20. You can play around with this number. This is just going to determine how hard the player bounces off the bottom of the screen. So if I run this again, let's just see if it works. Ah, there you go. So that's it. He's now bouncing off the bottom of the screen. I'm not controlling the player's bouncing. I'm not choosing, pressing space, for example, to jump. It's just a constant check that's happening. And this is going to be a feature of the game, that is just a constant bounce. And because I've got all the sides of the collision working, I can sort of bounce against the ends of the wall, each side. And basically, he's now contained within this game window. And that's how you add in some basics physics into the game. So it's simple, but it's quite effective, and I think it looks quite good. And the next thing, of course, is to add in platforms for the player to jump up on in a sort of ladder and to scroll the screen and so on. But I'm going to keep that for the next video. So for now, I'm just going to keep this one short. If you found this useful, then please do leave a like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.